Eagles on the Beat segment, where today we're going to talk a lot of Georgia football, talk a lot of playoffs. Didn't work out too good for Georgia there as far as the rankings and the future of Georgia football. I guess I'll start out with some of the more shocking news from today for me is the All-SEC team. You know, at the start of the year, there were only a couple guys that made first team for Georgia, and I thought, well, surely after everything Georgia accomplished this season, ranked number 5 in the country, sweeping through the East, beating all those East Division teams by double digits, only one first-team selection for Georgia on the AP All-SEC team. I mean, I don't know who they're consulting. I'm not sure who was voting. I see that Vanderbilt and Missouri were well represented, as was Kentucky. These are all teams Georgia beat. So my first response is, if Kirby Smart was able to go 11-1 in the regular season, ranked number 4 before the playoff game, with only one first-team All-SEC member, he must have done a heck of a job. I'd say, well, he should probably be the coach of the year, if not Nick Saban. Nick Saban just recorded the most dominant season, regular season in SEC history. The average margin of victory for Alabama this year, 35.2 points. But Nick Saban's not your coach of the year either. No, it's Mark Stoops from Kentucky, who pretty much got rewarded because Kentucky has been so lousy in football for so many years. And oh, by the way, Kentucky did lose to Tennessee as well as Georgia. Somehow that gets you coach of the year. I don't know who's doing the voting, but they blew it. They did a bad job. It's ridiculous that Georgia only has one first-team All-SEC guy. Even more ridiculous is some of the guys who got left off the second team. So let me review this. Connor Riley did a story. It's up on DawgNation right now if you want to take a look at who made first-team All-SEC. DeAndre Baker was the only Georgia football player that was deemed worthy of first-team All-SEC. Some guys on the second team, DeAndre Swift, who I think was playing as well as anybody at the end of the year, a second-team pick. Thomas, offensive tackle. He made it. Lamont Gaillard, the center, was second team. DeAndre Walker was second team. McCole Hardman is a punt returner. Rodrigo Blankenship, a second team pick, as a place kicker. No J.R. Reed, who I thought had a great year at safety for Georgia. No Jonathan Ledbetter. No Isaac Nauta. No Isaiah Wilson, who started every game and played darn near every snap at right tackle for the SEC's number 1 rushing team. I don't understand. I suppose if Kirby had left starters into games earlier in the year against teams like Austin Peay and Middle Tennessee and run up some statistics, maybe more guys would be on this team. Maybe Georgia would be in the playoff. We've come to a point now where the people that are choosing all-star teams and picking the playoff teams don't know anything about football, apparently, but they can read a statistics sheet. You know, it was a few weeks ago, and I can't remember if it was on the On the Beat segment or maybe the Chip and Griff show on a Tuesday, where I had talked about discussing why Georgia was ranked behind Michigan. And I asked the committee chairman, Rob Mullins, on a teleconference, why is Georgia ranked behind Michigan? They both had one loss. And he said because Michigan has the number 1 defense in the country. Statistically, they did. But then they went out and gave up 62 points to Ohio State. Now, statistically, Michigan was still number 1 in defense after that game in total yards allowed. But I'm confused as to why a committee chairman, someone with all these experts in the room, can't say, Michigan may give up fewer yards than anybody else, but they're not playing the same caliber of teams that these guys in the SEC are facing. Is Michigan really better than Georgia? I don't think so. But then I don't think Oklahoma is either. And I guess I'll turn my guns to that now, because when the committee chairman talked about this, he basically said that the people in that room couldn't come up with a consensus as who was better between Georgia, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. They couldn't differentiate. They couldn't discern that Georgia was the best of those 3 teams. They couldn't figure that out, or they couldn't come to a consensus. There were some coaches on that staff. Ken Hatfield, a retired coach, Bobby Johnson, a former coach at Vanderbilt. Frank Beamer had to recuse himself from the room when Oklahoma was being talked about. His son Shane, of course, the coach or one of the assistant coaches at Oklahoma. So Beamer wasn't in there, but Bobby Johnson and Ken Hatfield, two coaches that were in there, two guys that know the game. We don't know who said what. We know the Florida athletic director was a part of the discussion, Scott Strickland. We know that Georgia Tech's athletic director was part of the discussion. We know that Oklahoma's athletic director was part of the discussion when Georgia was brought up, but had to recuse himself, and it was Oklahoma. I don't know who said what, and I don't want to speculate that Georgia Tech or Florida, two of the rival schools, maybe would have their own self-serving interest in this discussion. But I do think if you're a Georgia fan, you have a right to wonder when you consider that the Ohio State AD was on this panel, the Oklahoma AD was on this panel, the Florida AD was on this panel, and the Georgia Tech AD was on this panel. I think you've got a right to wonder what was said by who. Unfortunately, it's not fair to us, the people that are trying to get the results, or to those athletic directors that we don't know who said what. There's no transparency in this process. This committee might have been a good idea, but it's gone bad because now politics have entered into it. The reason why, and getting back to the reason why Georgia was left out, was because that committee, with those people on it, weren't able to see that Georgia was better than Oklahoma. So they did the fallback. They said, well, we got to refer to our protocol, and here are some points we look at. And one of them is conference championship, and one of them is schedule strength. Well, Georgia has the number 6 schedule strength in the country. Oklahoma is 31. But that's not the one they picked. They didn't say, well, you know what? Georgia does have 2 losses, and Oklahoma only has 1, but we're going to take Georgia because they got the stronger schedule, and they played Alabama, who we think is the best team in the country. That's what the committee says. The committee says that Alabama is the number 1 team in the country. I think we would all agree with that. So you might think that because Georgia outgained Alabama, outplayed Alabama for most of that game, had no turnovers against Alabama and forced 2 Alabama turnovers, shut down the number 1 passing efficiency quarterback in the country and Heisman Trophy frontrunner, you might think the committee would say, wow, Georgia played Alabama that close and Alabama's number 1, so they're pretty good. They're pretty good. You might think that. But they said, you know what? We just don't know. Because Georgia's got 2 losses and Oklahoma only has 1. And, you know, gosh, yeah, Oklahoma did need overtime to beat Army, but they won that game. And Georgia, they lost by 20 at LSU. I would argue, folks, that needing overtime to beat Army at home is just as bad as losing on the road at LSU by 20 points. That's what I would argue on a day when everything went wrong for Georgia. Okay? Oh, by the way, Army outgained Oklahoma. That number 1 offense in the country scored 3 touchdowns in regulation against Army. Okay? You're telling me they're an option team. Okay, well, you know what? Georgia plays an option team too in Georgia Tech, and they stomped them. It didn't stop them from putting up 38 points in the first half. All right? So I got a big problem with the fact that this committee couldn't sort it out, couldn't figure out that Georgia was a better team than Oklahoma or Ohio State, and so therefore they had to fall back on protocol, and the protocol was conference championship. All right, now that's who's best. Now, if you're asking me who the most deserving is, I'm going to tell you the conference champions are. I said it last year. I've said it on this podcast several times. I've said it on several radio shows. I've said it on the SEC Network. Alabama did not deserve to be in the college football playoff last year. They did not deserve it. But Alabama was one of the 4 best teams. Okay? Now, if you're asking me, I say if we're going on who deserves it, Alabama did belong in, and Georgia did not belong in this year based on who deserves it. But I was corrected several times and told many, many ways that, Mike, it's not about who deserves it. It's not about what's fair. It's about who the 4 best teams are. And by gosh, that's why Alabama was in the playoff last year, even though they didn't even play in the conference championship game. Alabama was 11-1 and lost to Auburn. All right. Georgia was 11-1 and lost at LSU this year, a top 10 team. Georgia, at the end of the regular season, was ranked number 4 ahead of Oklahoma. Okay? That means that this committee decided that Oklahoma beating Texas 39-27 was more impressive than Georgia playing Alabama to 35-28. Alabama's number 1. Texas is number 15. That somehow the committee came. Georgia would have been better off not playing in the SEC championship game. They should have said, you know what, Greg Sankey, we're going to take a pass. We're going to sit here. We're going to sit on our 11-1 because we think that's good enough. No, instead they went out and darn near beat the number 1 team in the country. And the committee said, gosh, I don't know. Is that good? Is that good enough? Because, boy, Oklahoma sure looks good, scoring 39 points. Here's how good Oklahoma is. So I've got some of the data that this committee looked at, a side-by-side comparison here. Oklahoma does have the number 1 offense in the country, total offense. Georgia is number 13 in the country in total offense. So Oklahoma is 12 spots ahead of Georgia when it comes to offense. But on defense, Georgia's number 13. They're 13 on offense and defense. Oklahoma is 111 out of 130 teams. And if you say, well, they're in a high-scoring conference, Oklahoma is last in the Big 12 in total defense. They are last in the Big 12 in total defense. Let's take a look at third down offense. Oklahoma's number 4 in the country. Georgia's number 7 in the country. Third down defense, Georgia's 13th. Oklahoma is 108th. Let's look at scoring offense. Oklahoma's number 1. They score 50.3 points per game. Georgia's number 13. There's that number again. 40.1 for Georgia. So Oklahoma scores 10 points more than Georgia every game. But you know what? Oklahoma gives up 32.8 points per game. They're 100th in the nation. Georgia's 10th in the country. Georgia is the more balanced team. Georgia has played the tougher schedule. And anybody who can't look at on field and see that Georgia is the better football team than Oklahoma doesn't know football. And Gary Danielson said it best today on the SEC Network. Why are these people who watch film part-time, administrators, why are they granted the power to make this decision? What makes a Robert Morris president more informed than Steve Spurrier or an AP top 25 voter or a college football writer who covers it, 60 or 70 hours a week and goes to games and has seen other champions? Why are they more qualified? Because what? Based on who? Who came up with this? Whose idea was this? And Kirby Smart has a right to be upset. And he said it best. Every year it's going to be different. Last year they said, you know what? Alabama's one of the best. Doesn't matter that they didn't play in a championship game because Ohio State had a worse loss, right? That's what everybody said. Do you realize that Alabama got selected last year without any wins over top 15 teams in the regular season? The committee was able to figure out, and correctly so, I might say, because Alabama did win the title, but that last year's committee was able to figure out that even though Alabama didn't beat any top 15 teams during the regular season, they didn't beat anybody that finished in the top 15 during the regular season, and they lost by double digits at Auburn. That committee said, you know what? Even though Alabama didn't beat any teams ranked in the top 15, we still think they're one of the 4 best. Even though Ohio State won their conference championship over a top 5 team, they're going with Alabama. They're going to take Alabama because they're better. It's about who's best. We don't worry about anything else. It's all about who's best. That's what they said. This year, the committee changes. 6 new members. The new members, Florida AD, Georgia Tech AD, Oklahoma AD. This committee says, you know what? Even though Georgia beat Kentucky, that was ranked 10th, Florida, that was ranked 10th, Auburn, top 25 team, even though Georgia has those wins, we just can't tell if they're better than Oklahoma. Even though Georgia ranks in the top 20 top 15. Georgia ranks in the top 15 on offense and defense, and Oklahoma is first on offense but last on defense in their league. Just can't tell who's better. You know, I don't know who was behind the scenes. You know, maybe the Georgia Tech AD and the Florida AD were saying, man, put Georgia in. Gosh, guys, you got to put them in. Maybe they were the Georgia Tech AD stood on the table. Said, God, put Georgia. I don't know. I don't know who said what. They don't tell us that. They just say it was greatly debated. I don't know what the debate is. Georgia was one of the 4 best teams. I think we all know that. I think a lot of people are over it. Some people are saying, you know what, Mike? Doesn't matter. I'm done with it. I'm so mad Georgia lost. They had their chance and they didn't get in. They should have won the game. They don't deserve it. Okay. Well, then change the wording. Make it so you've got to win. And I said it last year. Make it a prerequisite to win your conference championship. Change the wording to say the 4 most deserving teams. But don't tell me that you're going to pick the 4 best teams, and don't tell me that you've got a committee of wise people, wise men, wise women that are so smart that they can figure out who the best teams are. But this year they couldn't. After watching Georgia outplay Alabama for most of that football game, after watching Georgia outgain Alabama, after watching Georgia and it should have been more turnovers. Alabama gets a fortunate fumble recovery in the end zone on a running back. Amazing. The guy can reach out and get it. How many times does that happen? Barely. A receiver gets hit over the middle. The ball pops 6 feet in the air. It goes right back in his hands like it's on a string. Look, these are the breaks of the game. All I'm saying is this. Anybody that watches that game between Georgia and Alabama thinks that if they play that game 10 times, it's going to be 5-5 at best. Right? But this committee couldn't figure it out. Maybe this committee are the same people that voted for the All-SEC team. Because to only have one Georgia guy make first-team All-SEC is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And then you're going to have the nerve to tell me that, but Kirby Smart's not the coach of the year? He wins the SEC East Division and plays Alabama even with one first-team All-SEC guy? He must be a great coach. Somebody got something wrong here. And if it wasn't Kirby, it should have been Nick Saban. Nick Saban just had the best regular season in SEC history. 35.2 average margin victory for Nick Saban with brand new coordinators. And Mark Stoops gets it? I mean, I'm sorry. I try not to throw other journalists under the bus. I don't even know who's on this committee. But they did a lousy job. Move on to something else now. Let's talk about Texas. Tom Herman coming up against Kirby Smart. It's the first time these guys have gone face-to-face, head-to-head, since the 2015 Sugar Bowl when Tom Herman was the Ohio State offensive coordinator and Kirby was the Alabama defensive coordinator. And that was the night that Cardale Jones, the third-string quarterback, led Ohio State to more than 500 yards against the Kirby Smart defense. I'd say Michael Thomas and Ezekiel Elliott had a lot to do with that also. But yet and still, when it happened, we were all stunned. I wasn't. I was actually covering the Big Ten that year, and I thought that the 2013 season, I thought Michigan State would have beaten Auburn or Florida State. That was Michigan State's best team. This particular Ohio State team beat a really good Michigan State team in East Lansing that year. And Ezekiel Elliott, that was kind of his coming out party. This guy was special, right? And I was told Michael Thomas was special too. And I think people in fantasy football figured that out this year. He's emerged as maybe one of the best receivers in the NFL. But so Kirby and Tom Herman reacquainting themselves. They both said that they're friends. They communicate. They share ideas and plans. So this is a friendly type of game. They like one another. They were very complimentary of one another on the Sugar Bowl teleconference yesterday. Pretty interesting. Tom Herman said that while they're in a league that throws it, they can play run defense too. They're not worried about Georgia's run game. You can bet that one's going to end up on the bulletin board for Georgia, as Georgia has the number one rushing offense in the SEC. Somehow, without any first-team All-SEC performers, they don't have anybody that's good enough to make first-team All-SEC, but they led the SEC in rushing. So it's pretty amazing to me. More news: Senior Bowl invites. Jonathan Ledbetter, who wasn't good enough to make first or second-team All-SEC, was one of 3 players invited to the Senior Bowl. The other 2 being DeAndre Walker and DeAndre Baker. Baker right now projected as the number 2 or number 3 cornerback in this upcoming NFL draft. Will be interesting to see if he goes to the Senior Bowl. Could he pass Greedy Williams from LSU? He's kind of the consensus number 1 corner. Could DeAndre Baker move into the top 10 of the draft order? I think DeAndre is a competitor. He's taken on the best receivers in the league all year long, but he's going to be told by his agent what he should do. And I know the competitor in DeAndre Baker would want to go there and try and shut down the best receivers at the Senior Bowl. I'm not sure what his agent will say. I think it's a no-brainer for DeAndre Walker and Jonathan Ledbetter to play in this game. Neither one of them are currently projected in the top 3 rounds. They got a chance to make a lot of money. Walker, I thought, was outstanding against Alabama. Late, he got injured. I thought that hurt that he wasn't in there on Alabama's last touchdown drive. We saw Cox lose contain again. This has been a problem for Cox all year. He may have gotten held on that play. Fill in the blank with your Alabama joke there. There were some calls in that game, potential late hit on Jason Stanley, questionable pass interference, I thought, on Eric Stokes. Listen, folks, I know I write for DawgNation and I cover Georgia, and I don't like sitting here sounding like a homer, but I know what I saw. And, if it wasn't this way, I would tell you. And believe me, I've certainly, heard from many Georgia fans saying that they feel like I've been too negative. But I got to call it like I see it. And at the start of the year, I thought the front 7 was suspect. Those guys grew up and played a hell of a game against Alabama. Georgia deserves to be in the college football playoff. They deserve, not deserve, under the current rules, Georgia should be in the college football playoff. Okay, my personal thought is that you should have to win your conference championship. But as the rules are drawn up, it's supposed to be the 4 best. And under those rules, just like Alabama got in last year, Georgia should have got in this year. Georgia should have more than 1 guy first-team All-SEC. There's no way that Mark Stoops should have been the coach of the year over Kirby Smart and Nick Saban. Should have been Nick Saban or Kirby Smart. In my mind, I don't know how it's not Nick Saban. I get it. He wins all the time. But this year they set a record. 35.2 points per game, average margin of victory. Winning your first 12 games by 20 points or more, something that hasn't happened in college football since 1888. I think people are asleep at the wheel here. Disappointed that more people aren't paying closer attention. Mel Tucker rumors. Let's move on to that. Here's the thing. Listen, I think there's been a lot of speculation that Mel Tucker was going to get a head coaching job this year, all year. He was a finalist. I was obviously covering Tennessee at this point last year. Mel was a finalist for the head coaching job with Kevin Steele of Auburn and Jeremy Pruitt. He was one of the 3 guys that was handpicked by Philip Fulmer to interview for the Tennessee position. I think Mel would have been a great coach at Tennessee. I think he will be a very good head coach. Is it Colorado? That's what the reports have been. I don't know that yet. It sure sounds like it. It seems like it. I know there's a Denver radio station that wants me on tomorrow to talk about Mel Tucker. They're chasing the same news as everyone else, but it hasn't been confirmed yet. And you just don't know, because here's the way it works now. Agents are powerful people, and they have their tentacles very deep into not just players, different administrators, but also some media members. And there's certain members of the media who have relationships with these agents. And when the agent calls them and tells them something, the guy goes with it. I mean, look, we all have our sources. We're all only as good as our sources. But sometimes an agent may float a guy out there, maybe to get him attention, maybe to make him more valuable. I'll give you an example of that. And I could be wrong here, but for example, Hugh Freeze, they wanted it out there that Hugh Freeze talked to Jeremy Pruitt about the Tennessee job. Okay. Do you know what Hugh Freeze and Jeremy Pruitt have in common? They have the same agent, Jimmy Sexton. Jimmy Sexton wants it out there that Hugh Freeze is a viable candidate. And if that means that Jeremy Pruitt interviewed him and well, look at this. And people say, oh, look, well, if Tennessee's considering hiring him, then maybe we should look at him too, right? Now, I could be wrong. They might hire him. I don't think there's any way. I would be shocked if Tennessee hired Hugh Freeze because I don't see Jeremy Pruitt running an offense like Hugh Freeze wants. I think Jeremy's going to run the offense a certain way, just like I think Kirby Smart and Nick Saban have certain parameters for how they want their offense run. And I think Hugh Freeze needs to go somewhere where he can, run wild and be free with his offense and, perhaps otherwise. I don't know. But so play the what if game with me. What if Mel Tucker looks at Colorado and says, yeah, boy, I don't know if that's a good fit for me. But the agent comes back. Yeah, but you know what, Mel? Let's float it. Let's leave it out there because now people know you're a viable candidate. Other schools may have interest. They go, well, look, Mel's more valuable now because he was a candidate and a finalist and a guy that Colorado wanted, right? That's why coaches play this out. Jeff Brom, Louisville, Jeff Brom, Tennessee last year. You didn't hear anybody from Purdue going, oh, no, he's not going. They let it play out. It built his value. It's a negotiating tool. And so, we, us writers, we call our sources. Oh, I don't know anything about it. It's not a done deal. People reading it. Well, geez, I thought I read this Saturday morning that he was going to be hired. And it's Monday now. It hasn't happened yet. It could happen at any time. It could have happened during this podcast. But maybe it doesn't. And so it puts us all in a very compromised position here in terms of what we know, what we don't know, and what information we can trust, especially when it's unsourced. And so my advice and my personal thought is until it happens, you just don't know. Now, that said, I'm going to be looking real close at candidates. I know Chip Towers has done a story today, a Towers take, on Mel Tucker leaving and what he thinks might happen. I think he thinks Glenn Schumann might get the internal promotion because realistically, whoever the defensive coordinator is going to run Kirby's defense. Nobody's going to come in here and sit at the table and tell Kirby Smart what the Georgia defense is going to look like, okay? This has got to be somebody that speaks Alabama. This has got to be somebody that has a very similar philosophy to Kirby Smart and somebody that understands that at the end of the day, Kirby Smart is going to tell you what kind of defense you're going to run. You may put your touch on it, but you're going to have to earn some trust from Kirby. Mel Tucker had done that. They were a dynamic combination. You got to give Mel Tucker a lot of credit. You look at the way these Georgia DBs developed. This is the best secondary in the country. They probably should have 2 first-team All-SEC guys. I think J.R. Reed played great. Again, they don't have the tackle numbers that some of these other guys do because they got off the field because Kirby substituted and when they were winning big games, and whoever voted just apparently can't look past the stat sheet. And again, that's pretty unfortunate. So we'll wait and see what happens with Mel Tucker. My feeling is Mel's ready to be a head coach, but I also don't think that he wants to take a job that's not a good fit for him, regardless of the money. Because Georgia's going to be awful doggone good next year as well. Georgia's probably going to be back in the SEC championship game. My guess is they make the college football playoff, and I would say they would be an early favorite to win the national championship next season based on what I saw from those guys Saturday. Talking to a lot of the freshmen. We'll have stories on that on DawgNation as the week progresses, as we were able to talk to a lot of the freshmen. Those freshmen learned a valuable lesson. They got a look in their eye. There's a chip on their shoulder, whatever you want to say. There's a hunger, and you saw Kirby Smart's reaction. Pounding the table, fired up, combative coach, really respect Kirby standing up for his guys, saying what was on his mind. He's one of those rare coaches that's going to tell you what he thinks, even if it's not maybe politically correct. Kirby's gone out there and said some things. One final thought here, I suppose. I see the 5 minute, my cues flashing here. Georgia's schedule this year didn't help them. I'm a big proponent. You know where I sit with this committee. I've made it very clear that I've lost faith in this committee. I think it's an unfortunate situation. There's not enough transparency. It puts athletic directors in a bad spot. Again, I don't know what the Georgia Tech athletic director, Florida athletic director said about Georgia being in or out, but what a tough spot to be in. Because after all, isn't it their responsibility to do what's best for their school at the end of the day? I mean, are we supposed to believe that people will I'm just going to leave it alone. I'm just not going to go any further because I know the Florida AD. I trust him. I think he's a really good guy. I think he's a good person. I don't think he would lie or mislead anyone. I just think he's in a really tough spot, just like the Georgia Tech AD, to say anything that would help Georgia when that's their chief rival. It puts them in a very compromised position. This whole committee concept, just to me, it's got a human element that none of us can get away from. But all that said, Georgia's going to move on now. People have asked me, do I think they're going to be fired up? Yes.
because that's the way Georgia is. These kids play with a lot of pride, and there's a lot of competition on this team, and they're going to want to get a jump. This is the beginning of next season for Georgia. And I think seniors will play, and it's about sending some seniors out right, although we still need to wait and see which seniors are going to play in the game. But there's a lot of young guys that are going to be pushing for playing time, and I think that internal competition is going to lead to some really good bowl practices. And I do think Georgia will go out there with a chip on their shoulders. Devastating as that loss was, Jake Fromm's been playing outstanding. I don't expect that to change. Justin Fields will certainly want to make the most of his opportunities, and I'm sure that Georgia will make sure that he has some opportunities. So my thought on the Sugar Bowl is, while right now it may be hard for people to get amped up about it, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for Georgia. It's a New Year's Six Bowl. It will have national recruiting implications. It's a chance for Kirby to showcase his program. I think moving forward, Kirby will probably keep his foot on the gas a little bit more in some of these games, run up some bigger numbers. This committee was obviously very impressed with statistics. You hate to think that it takes running up the score, but this is where we're at now. This is the way it is. And I would also say that Georgia should look at their schedule. Playing Austin Peay in Middle Tennessee, one of the arguments I heard was Georgia didn't have a really great out-of-conference win to offset that LSU loss. What was their best win? I heard a lot of people asking that question. And, when you play Austin Peay and Middle Tennessee State and UMass and Georgia Tech, that's not impressive, not at all. It would have helped to have a Notre Dame win on there. But so some poor scheduling, I think, caught up with Georgia when this decision was made. But again, I've made my thoughts clear on this. Tonight, by the way, Georgia basketball game. I'll be checking that out over there at Stegman Coliseum. And, so digging in, trying to get more stories done. I'm going to have another Tom Herman story on Texas. I have some story on Kirby Smart, what he has to say about the bowl game. And I will start doing some of these interview stories, video with some of the freshmen. I know Jeff Sentell is on recruiting right now. Some pretty big recruiting news out there if you haven't checked that out on DawgNation. I encourage you to go to the DawgNation forum. I visit there frequently. If you have any messages or any thoughts, drop them in there. Or you can direct message me on Twitter at Mike Griffith 32. On Twitter is your Twitter file at Mike Griffith 32. And no problem. Love to interact with fans and get your point of view and hear what you've got to say. I'll do more Facebook Lives this month. I know that I'll do one of these later this month as well. Maybe not for a couple of weeks. I know we've got some scheduling issues coming up here, but I'll try and get on here at least once a week in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a Facebook Live or if we were able to do the Ingles on the Beat segment another day of the week to get your thoughts and get some feedback as things play out. I think we're all still absorbing what happened Saturday night and how the committee treated Georgia. And now this AP All-SEC made a mockery out of Georgia's season with only one Georgia guy first team and picking the Kentucky coach as the SEC Coach of the Year. I mean, it's just maybe somebody got confused and thought it was basketball season or something. I don't know. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up from here. Mike Griffith, I want to thank Ingles. Great sponsorship. Check out your Ingles supermarket. This has been the Ingles on the Beat segment, and I'll be back on here some way, shape, or form next week to talk more Georgia football, share more thoughts as we see how things unfold here in the coming days.